For months now, we've been hearing it, reading about it everywhere. US President Donald Trump has repeatedly suggested that Canada should become the 51st state, a statement that has unsettled many Canadians. A lot of people in Canada like the idea of becoming our beautiful, cherished 51st state, Trump has said. They'd pay much lower taxes and have the ultimate security. There's a common belief that if the United States wanted to take over Canada, it could do so effortlessly. After all, the US boasts the world's most powerful military, with 1.1 million active duty personnel, a population 750% larger, and an economy nearly 10 times the size of its northern neighbor. And historically, the US has attempted to invade Canada multiple times, each attempt ending in failure. But why is this situation different from other territorial expansions, like China's claim over Taiwan or Russia's annexation of Crimea? If powerful nations can expand their borders, what has stopped the US from absorbing Canada? The answer is far more complex than it may seem. Let's break it down. Despite what Trump may believe, the US can't simply annex Canada, and in reality, neither country wants that. In a 2025 survey, 80% of Canadians stated they would never vote for Canada to become part of the United States. However, 22% said they would support Quebec or Alberta joining the US if those provinces chose independence through a referendum. Additionally, 30% said they would consider unification if the US offered all Canadians full citizenship and a complete conversion of their financial assets to US dollars. For many Canadians, the real concern isn't whether they want to join the US, it's whether America could take over if it wanted to. And if that were to happen, what would it look like? Since taking office, Trump has been aggressive on multiple fronts, cracking down on illegal immigration, attempting to acquire Greenland and the Panama Canal, and imposing tariffs on key trade partners like China and Canada. In response, Canada has retaliated by imposing tariffs on $107 billion worth of U.S. imports, including an immediate $21 billion in goods. To some, this escalation signals a growing conflict between the two nations. Could it eventually lead to an actual takeover? Most Canadians see annexation as an unrealistic idea. Canada is a sovereign nation with its own government, laws, and distinct identity. Unlike Germany's annexation of Austria in 1938, where Nazi Germany, under Hitler, exploited cultural and linguistic ties to justify expansion, there has never been a similar movement in the US aimed at forcibly absorbing Canada. The two nations have always maintained separate identities, governance structures, and political systems. More importantly, any attempt by the US to annex Canada would violate international law, including the United Nations Charter, which protects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of independent nations. Canada has been self-governing since 1867 and gradually gained full independence from British rule throughout the 20th century. After all that effort, it's safe to say that a country of over 40 million people wouldn't surrender without resistance. To fully understand this, it helps to look back at history. Since the War of 1812, no country has successfully invaded Canada. While Canada fought in that war, it didn't attain full sovereignty until 1982, following a long path to self-governance that began with Confederation in 1867. The process was solidified by the Statute of Westminster in 1931, which granted Canada greater autonomy. Though Indigenous peoples had lived in the land for thousands of years before European colonization, Canada's formal journey to nationhood took over 4 centuries. But despite all this, Trump seems to believe that nothing is beyond his reach. His plans are undeniably ambitious. While many dismiss them as unrealistic, others argue that he has a track record of turning radical ideas into reality. So why hasn't he taken action against Canada yet? One key reason is the deep historical and economic ties between the two nations. The US and Canada work closely on multiple fronts, culturally, politically, and economically. Millions of dual citizens exist between them, and their economies are highly interdependent. Both nations belong to the 49% of countries worldwide that allow dual citizenship. They also collaborate on global security matters, from NATO operations in Europe to maritime enforcement in the Indo-Pacific region. The idea of the US invading Canada is comparable to attacking a close neighbor, one that's also a relative and business partner. Another major deterrent is international opposition. Canada's ties to the Commonwealth and nations like the UK, France, and Australia mean that any aggressive move by the US would likely face global resistance. Stéphane Dion, Canada's ambassador to France, has openly condemned Trump's expansionist rhetoric, stating that international law does not permit such threats. Geography is another challenge. Canada's vast landscape makes invasion extremely difficult. With a 5,525-mile shared border and over 120 land entry points, it has the longest international border in the world. Disrupting this relationship would be a costly mistake for the US, as both economies thrive on cross-border trade, which amounts to $2.6 billion in goods and services daily. In contrast to places with ongoing territorial disputes, like Israel and Palestine, Canada and the US have stable, recognized borders. Canada's rugged terrain, massive forests, and extensive coastline make military occupation highly impractical. Additionally, Canada isn't seen as a high-priority target. While the nation is rich in natural resources like oil, lumber, minerals, and fresh water, the costs of an invasion would far outweigh the benefits. Governing such a large and diverse nation would present overwhelming challenges, not to mention the fierce resistance from the Canadian population. History shows that acquiring resources through economic agreements is far more efficient than military conquest. So if the US and Canada have such strong ties, why is Trump even discussing annexation? This rhetoric could easily strain the relationship between the two nations. In fact, it already has. Some Canadian provincial leaders have launched campaigns encouraging citizens to spend their money domestically rather than in the US. Others have gone as far as canceling trips south of the border in protest. This is significant, given that Canada is the largest source of international tourists to the US, with 20.4 million visitors in 2024 alone, bringing in $20.5 billion and supporting 140,000 American jobs. In February 2025, Visual Capitalist conducted a survey asking Canadians how they feel about Trump's vision of Canada as the 51st state. Among 1,000 Canadians aged 18 and older, over 70% were firmly against the idea. However, younger generations seemed more open to the concept. 43% of Canadians aged 18 to 34 said they would support joining the US if guaranteed citizenship and financial asset conversion, compared to just 17% of those aged 55 and older. But even with these opinions, the reality remains. America is in no position to conquer Canada. Even Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has stated that Trump's desire to annex Canada stems more from economic interests than military ambitions, particularly in gaining access to Canada's critical minerals. Despite his bold claims, Trump himself has ruled out military force. In a January 7, 2025, news conference at Mar-a-Lago, he suggested using economic leverage instead. He argued that merging the two nations would cut U.S. border security costs while improving national security. He even claimed that Canada costs the U.S. $200 billion annually and that annexation would lead to lower taxes for American citizens. While Trump's comments continue to fuel debate, the idea of annexing Canada remains highly unlikely. Political, cultural, and economic barriers make such a move practically impossible. Sovereignty and national identity hold more weight than ever in today's world, making forced annexation an outdated concept. Instead of conquest, cooperation remains the more viable path forward for both nations. That said, Trump still has 4 more years in office, enough time to push his agenda further. Whether this will amount to serious action or remain political rhetoric is yet to be seen. But one thing is certain, many Canadians are watching with concern.